Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSB. It's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 5th of May 2024. I'm going to fairly much rush through this due to the fact I need to go and spend some time with the family. I will probably add my military aid and even geopolitical videos onto tomorrow's. So they might be a little bit longer. I don't know if I'll do a late night one. We'll see. Anyway, I won't go too granular today on the Frontline update, even though it deserves it. There have been an awful lot of changes. It's not looking good for the Ukrainians in all the usual places. So I could spend a lot of time on that. But just because I don't have the time, I won't. It's not because it's not serious enough or I'm trying to evade giving you bad news or whatever. That's a load of nonsense. I just have to get through this as quickly as possible. So sorry about that. Anyway, there are, as you can see, quite a lot of pins. And each of these areas represent a really big number of pins. First thing I'm going to say is along the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea up here. And remember, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key. We are going to go to the very northern part of this, along the Oskil River as it joins the wooded area up by Sinkivka. And I believe that Surat Maps, the pro-Russian map, has done a lot of rejigging to basically get the map making sense of the river. It was a bit inaccurate, and so there are loads of changes to that, but they are rejigs. They are not Surat maps showing that the Russians have made gains. So he's just pushed the lines up to the river. So JR, who did two-thirds of the mapping today, has changed Surat maps in accordance with that. That was quite a lot of work for him, so thanks, mate. Really appreciate that. But it doesn't suggest any movements. That could also be what's going on here by Sinkivka. I don't think the Russians have to the west of Liman Pershi made some gains there. I think that's likely rejigging. There was some sad news at Vovan. The guy that was involved in Ukraine Enemy in the Woods BBC documentary, him and 5 of his colleagues died in a Russian tank attack somewhere around here. So it is still really active around there, even though we've had quite a bit of stability. Where it's been pretty dynamic is around the Kislivka, Kotelyrivka area, where it looks like the Russians, as according to all the mappers, have taken quite a bit of land actually around the Kotelyrivka area, taking that town. All the mappers agree with that. And indeed, they've pushed really quite a bit to the west around there. So there was a bit of a pocket of no man's land just here to the east of Kotelyrivka, and that has gone by the waysides. As Deep State Maps says, the yellow line, the enemy occupied Kotelyrivka, so there is agreement that has fallen there, and I think there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that, which is why all the mappers have changed accordingly there. So that's not good news for the Ukrainians. They are having a bit of a hard time in that area. But I guess if you want to really see this in a most positive of lights, this is just a small couple of villages up in this northeastern axis. It's not going to change an awful lot. You start worrying if the Russians get across the Oskil River, right? I mean, this is your big problem. If the Russians take back as much of this territory as possible and get past the Zherebets River and then the Oskil River, that's a serious issue, because that was the advantage of the Ukrainians doing that Kharkiv counteroffensive, that lightning counteroffensive. They were able to get across quite a few of these natural barriers there. By the way, the Kiev Independent has said that, according to a Ukrainian commander, the Russian aim is to completely occupy 3 oblasts. That's Donetsk, Luhansk, and, if possible, Zaporizhia oblasts. So there's still the intention. If you look at the white dotted line here, I know it's not particularly clear there, but that is, if you follow my mouse, that is Luhansk. So they would still need to take a fair bit of Luhansk, but that's not a particularly tall order compared to taking Donetsk, which would include an awful lot more ground coming to the west here. So just trying to find Donetsk Oblast. So yeah, that would be taking all of this area here. That's a much more difficult thing to achieve. And then taking all of Zaporizhia would mean taking all of this area here. And again, that is a tall order. So Luhansk is your more realistic one, because it's not too far until you go into Kharkiv Oblast. So this is Kharkiv Oblast here. And it's the Oskil River. Well, it's not the Oskil River. It's this small area around Stena Makivka and Makivka Nevska here that the Russians would need to take. Anyway, as we come down to Bilahorivka, although it's pretty dynamic around there is activity there. We come to Chaziv Yar, where we can see that Deep State Maps has clarified some areas of Chaziv Yar, the micro district, the canal micro district here, or just to the east of that. There has been some clarification of the Russian control in that area. They all generally agree about that the Russians aren't quite in that area yet, although Surret Maps did previously state that. No news about these other areas around Ivanivska, north of Ivanivska, Mount Baba here, going westwards, and even Ivanivska itself. There are some fairly big differences between all the mappers all around here, even down to Klishchivka. Surret Maps saying that the Russians have made some gains north of Klishchivka there, but nothing too significant. I would like to know exactly what is going on here. It's obviously going to be incredibly dynamic and hard fought over, given that this is one of the places that the Ukrainians are expecting to cede before probably the summer or sometime around the summertime. It's going to be difficult for the Russians, but it is kind of one of the expected objectives, and there is that acknowledgement that they aren't going to keep hold of it, the Ukrainians. The occupiers destroyed a bridge over the Seversky Donetsk canal on the outskirts of Chaziv Yar. You can see the canal and how that might be challenging. That's a good defensive line. There are bridges over it. We're going to just punch this in to the Google map to see where that bridge might be. And I'm actually going to bring the bridges up that JR added to the map sometime back. These purple pins. And yeah, those are all the pins for today. Now let's put the bridges on. Here we go. Right, so let's see which of the bridges has been blown up. And apparently this is a bridge that recently been built by the... Yes, so there is no bridge there. And that's because this is, as said here, recently built. So it's geolocated to that point, but it has been recently built by, one presume, the Ukrainians. So that's been blown up. That no longer is, even though we didn't have it as one of our pins. So that means that, I mean, you wonder why the Russians would do that, because surely they would want to use these access points themselves. You'd expect the Ukrainians to blow these up, but then it means that the Ukrainians are going to find it very difficult to supply the canal micro district here, and so that would enable the Russians to properly take that, and then they can work out how to cross the canal itself at some later point. So interesting that they've destroyed that bridge. Right, we are then going to come down past Chaziv Yar and Bakhmut and come to Pin City here, which, I mean, this is all bad news, isn't it? So is the Ocheratina area and the Novokalnyove area going towards Kalnyove. It is a case that the Russians are just expanding everywhere around here. Now, I don't know how expensive this is being for the Russians. I mean, there is a lot of footage coming out. I don't know if it's been as expensive as it had been previously for their advances in many of these areas. Yeah, I can't speak to that, but they are taking some fairly significant territory, equalizing stuff around here from sort of Keramik all the way to, basically it's this town of Arkhangelska, which is, I presume here. Now there's a flag that's been raised in that town. George Barros has said that. He's from Institute for the Study of War. He says a Russian flag appeared in the northern part of Arkhangelska, Donetsk Oblast on the 4th of May, indicating Russian forces likely seized the town or the village, as Russian sources themselves claimed. So let's plug that in and see where that takes us. It appears nowhere fast, and that is because it's got a full stop at the end. Take that out. There we go. So that's right on the northern edge of the village, which means, yep, it's likely that that is under Russian control. It's unlikely to be one of these times where they're just rushing in, putting a flag down and then running away. This is an example of them taking that. The Ukrainians would have pulled back behind the water features there. I assume there's some ponds and rivers and whatever that they're going to be pulling back behind. The Russians have made some significant gains in that area, as according to all the mappers, as well as pushing northwest of Ocheritina towards Novo-Alexandrivka. So that seems to be their next objective in this direction, and the Russians having made some gains along a tree line here and expanding in this field area, at least according to Andrew Perpetua, agreeing with what Surrey Maps had previously said. Then as we come down further to the south, we have south of the railway lines and Ocheritina, the Russians making gains there too. Fairly worrying this as they're moving, well beyond. I was talking about how this area was the Ukrainians on the high ground. You've got the Derna River down here, and you had all the places like Bedici and then Semenivka, Orlivka and whatnot, and the Ukrainians were holding them behind the river, but the worry was if they got to the north and then could pop down, and indeed that's exactly what has happened. And the 115th, who were the unit that was supposed to have been holding here and went AWOL, have denied that that's what happened. So they're not happy with the poor PR that they are getting for being supposedly responsible for this. Who knows exactly what happened, but it seems that the 47th were called back in because some cock-up happened. And anyway, this has now become an incredibly expensive mistake by the Ukrainians, if indeed that was what happened. And then as we come down the Derna River, you can see that the Russians are making lots of gains just around Umanska as well. So this is not looking good, as they're certainly up to the river and arguably over the river to the west of Orlivska and indeed Semenivka as well. So the Ukrainians are likely going to be pulling back from here, because they'll be worried about getting attacked from essentially three sides. They'll probably equalize it at some point. You would assume that they have some kind of more major fortifications set up behind here, although there have been claims that they are yet to have built proper fortifications, that they are indeed much further back, and it's in this area that they desperately need it. I have seen some mapping to indicate that they do have fortifications here, larger trench works, more so than the smaller ones that were more hastily constructed as they were kind of retreating and whatnot. But it is all fairly worrying, as you can see. That is just it's a sea of pins. And then we come down to around the Pervomaisky onto Netayalove area, where the Russians are just moving slowly through, or fairly consistently, it's not too slowly, through Netayalove, street by street, taking more ground. All the mappers agree with that too. And there's this pocket around Korovnik, where the Russians are moving south from Pervomaisky. All the mappers now agree that that salient is under Russian control and that it leaves this pocket of no man's land. But Suret Maps has some Ukrainian gains here. That's likely, realistically, a rejig. I haven't read what they've said about it, but they never had Novelska, and they've bit by bit said, yeah, no Ukrainian gains, but actually it's not Ukrainian gains. It's the Russians never did make those gains. This is an important place. It'll be interesting to see how long this holds out. I mean, I assume the Ukrainians are going to pull out of here, if indeed they still are there, and you'll have something looking like that. But it's Novelska, as small as an agricultural settlement that is, it is very well fortified. They've been there for a long time, but facing the mass of the Russian army here, as they are throwing more and more vehicles and human beings at what are very tired and still probably not well equipped enough Ukrainian troops, they might have some success there, the Russians. So yeah, just all those pins tells you what's been going on the last actually 24 to 36 hours. Some of these gains are from Andrew Perpetua's mapping. The last two updates all accumulated into one. It's been a bit of an odd weekend for me, thanks to JR, who has helped, of course, but I've been unable to dedicate as much time as I would have liked to have done. And when you come into Krasnohorivka, Deep State Maps and Surat maps showing that the Russians have moved deep into Krasnohorivka, some expansion of the Russian control according to Surat maps, and deep state maps starting to agree with Surat maps. Again, it could be the case that Surat maps is not correct with the initial changes, but then it eventually does come true, as I keep saying. So it's not that that's a robust control today, that the Russians have attacked into there. They might well have been repelled, and then Surat maps changes the map and say, look, there was a Russian BMP there, so they control all that. But they end up being true, and therefore end up feeling like they've been validated as a mapper, because the Russians do just keep pushing, and then eventually they will take it, as I'm sure they'll take probably all of Krasnohorivka. Like, I imagine as part of this whole offensive phase, they're going to take, I mean, who knows how much they'll take of all of this kind of Donetsk area, but they are going to continue pushing and throw everything and the kitchen sink, or at least somewhat at this. There are talks, as I keep saying, of them amassing troops for a further summer offensive, troops and equipment. So it's going to be a tough couple of months for the Ukrainians, no matter what. Like, even the best case scenario, it's going to be damage limitation for the Ukrainians. The question is always, can they exact a cost from the Russians that means that the Russians will be in a worse, like a sort of Pyrrhic victory for the Russians? They take that land and they have what they might deem as a successful spring offensive into summer, but it leaves them absolutely exhausted at the end of that. Now, the reality is that Ukrainians without mass mobilization will themselves be exhausted. You know, then I think as exhausted and as much as the Russians would have culminated eventually, to leave them, you know, really susceptible, vulnerable to a Ukrainian counterattack, I think the Ukrainians are going to be very challenged to commit enough troops to a significant counterattack, because they have really struggled with mobilization, and that continues. So then when we come down further towards Novomykolivka, we can see that the Russians have had some success both in Novomykolivka, moving on to Paraskevivka, the next target here. In fact, they're in that according to Surat maps, and that's quite significant, because that's the last town, the last place before, or village before Konstantinivka, which is the key for this area. You've got Konstantinivka being the key there, and Kurakova being the key here, further up. And then when we come up to the Avdiivka salient, it all gets a little bit bigger, where you kind of, yes, they're moving towards Pokrovsk, but really they want to interdict this road and try and join up from what they do in Chaziv Yar on this larger Konstantinivka there. That's the big goal. But, you know, that will take an awful lot of resources to achieve that. As far as this Konstantinivka is concerned, because, you know, Ukraine, of course, we're going to have lots of places with the same name on the same part of the front line. It is worrying that the Russians are still making these gains. Deep state map, well, it might not be that they made these gains in the last 24 hours. That's going to be an alignment of the mappers there. As you can see, he's just saying, yep, I agree with what Surat maps and Andrew Perpetua previously had, but it's this move into Paraskevivka, which is pretty worrying. Then when we come down past the dogleg around into moving towards the Zaporizhia Oblast, kind of on the border or close to the border of the Zaporizhia Donetsk Oblast, we come to Uruzhaine and the Velika Novoselka salient. As you see, Andrew Perpetua agrees that the Russians have indeed taken all of this land north and northeast of the Mokry-Yali, what was it, river? Mokry-Yali river there. Now, here we have, I'm going to show you Andrew Perpetua's map. So this is what Andrew's map looks like, and you see that there has been, this is what it looked like 2 days ago. And I did take a screenshot of this, but I forgot to show it to you. It just goes to show what the Russians do, which is absolutely hammer the crap out of a place and then move in. So they've got smoke attacks, airstrikes, those huge car bombs littering the place, shelling, and that will include, no doubt, multiple launch rocket system shells, airstrikes hitting all over the shop, drone strikes. Ukrainians trying to hit back with blowing up a whole bunch of Russian vehicles here. So the Russians appear to have lost, I mean, goodness me, a lot of vehicles, BMPs and tanks, BMPs, a lot of BMPs, T-62 tank, MTLB, so armored personnel carriers, so on and so forth. So it looks like the Russians have lost a lot of equipment and the Ukrainians haven't, as in they probably haven't got the equipment there. They're not using things like tanks and APCs. They're just set up shop in Uruzhany. But again, the Russians end up taking this ground. The question is always, at what cost? So an abandoned tank and another tank, so some more geolocations today. But yeah, at what cost? Is it worth it for them? So if the Ukrainians can exact huge costs out the Russians for taking that territory, then it is a worthwhile exchange. Okay, then we're going to come down. So that's happening in Uruzhany. No change in Robotyne salient in this area, in the Malatok-Machka Orikhiv direction. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there. No news is good news. And then here we have a moment of good news for the Ukrainians. It's a rare thing at this time. So this is, if we come to Getty here, Krinky, left bank of the Kherson region, the Marines managed to expand the bridgehead to the west, as evidenced by the Russian strikes on Ukrainian positions in the village. Also, a video of our Marines crossing from the island opposite Krinky to the shore in the village was recently published, which indicates partial control over the island. So good news there and all the mappers agree with this as well, that the Ukrainians are expanding their bridgehead going down to the southwest, which is interesting because for several reasons. I mean, one, this is all rubberized, and so it's very difficult to just exist here at all. You are very open. Like, it may look like there are a lot of buildings, but this is just grass and rubble. And what does control really look like? But again, it's not that the Ukrainians control this, it's that the Russians don't control this. And remember, this is not these are Russian defensive lines. So it means that the Russians controlling this area and being in this neck of the woods is now no longer the case. Does it mean that the Ukrainians control this? No. The Ukrainians are going to be back here. This is what they control. The Russians aren't around here at all. The Ukrainians generally will control this. But, of course, they're very vulnerable to strikes by the Russians in terms of FPV drones particularly. And they lose a lot of boats in this area. But they are pushing the Russians back and along here. The question then is, well, to what end? Is this still about attriting Russian units around here, mechanized equipment and troops? Or are they really hoping on expanding this more properly at some point? But in order to expand it properly at some point, they need to at least have a foothold there. And so if they give up that foothold, is it that they're far more unlikely to ever get it back? Like, you can hold on to something like this and it will cost you. But even though it will cost you in an ongoing basis, it won't cost you as much as if you then lost it and then tried to regain it or try to get a foothold anywhere across the other side of the river, because the Russians would just see you coming and it would be an absolute nightmare. So now they've got it. It could be the Ukrainians are trying their hardest to keep it just because they need somewhere as a foothold if they have any intentions of seriously taking back this land. But also it's that calculation that it attracts the Russian troops into there, both mechanized equipment and personnel, so that the Ukrainians can use a very effective drone warfare in the area to take out those Russian units. So this is being successful for the Ukrainians, at least under some metrics. But that is a rare bit of success on a front line. Essentially, things are looking particularly challenging around Avdiivka, Krasnohorivka, Novomakilivka, and indeed Uruzhany area as well has really flared up too, and not to forget Kislivka and Kotelyrivka in the north as well. So challenging for the Ukrainians. The sooner they get that equipment, the better, and the sooner they get the F-16s in the air, the better, one would assume. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.